Hi, I'm Nat Rittmeyer, and this is Biblical Historical Context. The Tel Dan Stele is a great example of the sort of archaeological discovery that apologists use to prove the Bible true. Now, sure, it mentions the House of David, and from an apologetics point of view, that's pretty cool, but staying at that level can feel pretty shallow. When you dig deeper, the inscription highlights aspects of the biblical text that we might otherwise miss, aspects that force us to engage with the biblical text in more sophisticated ways than we otherwise might, and that's way more interesting and useful than apologetic chest beating. So if that's your thing, like, share, subscribe, and stick around. We're going beyond apologetics. What we're going to do is have a brief look at the way people were thinking about the Bible in the lead up to the stele's discovery. We'll look at how the Tel Dan Stele was found, dated, and read. We'll see how the relevant scholars figured out who it mentions, and it's more than just the House of David. In the second half, we'll get into the more interesting stuff. We'll see how the events related in the inscription line up or not with the way they're recorded in the biblical text, and we'll think a little about what this means for the way we read and think about the historical books of the Bible. So, let's get started. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists working in the Middle East dug with a spade in one hand and a Bible in the other. These were the days of biblical archaeology, when archaeology proved the Bible true. But in the late 80s, things got considerably more complicated. Due to new discoveries and more modern methods, interpretations of various discoveries were revised and overturned. Old conclusions were shown to be incorrect, and confidence in a face value, literal reading of the historical books of the Bible really dropped off. At the extreme end of this development were a group of scholars who came to be labelled minimalists for their shared view that there's precious little in the historical books that's historically accurate. In their eyes, the historical value of the biblical text was minimal. Here's an example of the sort of thing that was being written about such central characters as Saul and David in the early 1990s. The narratives of Saul and David serve no evident purpose at this point in the history of the kingdoms of Palestine. Who would need persuading of what by such fictions? So David, in the eyes of the minimalists, was a fiction. Elsewhere in the same book we come across this. Whoever is living in the Palestinian highlands around 1000 BCE, they do not think, look, or act like the people the biblical writers have put there. They are literary creations. Around 1000 BCE, he's talking about the time of David. So David was thought of as a fiction, a literary creation. And there are similar quotes from other minimalist scholars that we could have used, but the one we just looked at is important because of the timing. That book, by Professor of Biblical Studies at Sheffield, Philip Davies, was published in 1992, just 1 year before the discovery of the Tel Dan Stele, and his timing, as we'll see, was terrible. In the far north of the modern state of Israel, at the foot of Mount Hermon and only a few meters from the border with Lebanon, lie the remains of the ancient city of Dan, the site known today as Tel Dan. Being one of the sources of the River Jordan, it's a beautiful green site and a welcome relief from the summer heat for tourists visiting the Holy Land. Excavations began at Tel Dan in 1963, and even before the stele was discovered, the site was already famous for the discovery of what's known as Abram's Gate, a well-preserved Middle Bronze mud brick gate, and also the High Place, said to be the altar built by Jeroboam. But it was in 1993 that the site's most significant discovery would take place. In 1993, the site was being excavated by director of the Nelson Glueck School of Biblical Archaeology at Hebrew University College, Avraham Biran. Outside of excavation season, Biran drove up to the site from Jerusalem to show a visitor around the place. His site surveyor, Gila Cook, hitched a ride as she had some surveying work she wanted to finish at the site. After some time, the tour of the site was over and Biran called over to Cook to pack up her stuff. It was time for the long drive home. Cook's surveying equipment was bulky, so on the way back to the car she set some of it down to rearrange it so she could carry it a little easier. As she bent down to pick it up again, she noticed that the light had fallen on a particular stone sticking up out of a newly excavated wall, and on it she could see what looked like an inscription. She called Biran over, they freed the slab, and they could make out the letters of an inscription as clear as day. As many scholars have noted, Biran was quick to get the inscription published, something he did with Joseph Naver, a professor of West Semitic epigraphy and paleography at the Institute of Archaeology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Quite a mouthful. When their article entitled An Aramaic Stele Fragment from Tel Dan was published in the Israel Exploration Journal, it became front-page news, like New York Times front-page news. The reason for the global interest was because of what was found on the 9th line of the inscription. According to Biran and Naver, it said, "And I slew the king of the house of David." This was, to understate things, a flipping huge deal. This was earth-shaking stuff. The house of David. The vast majority of scholars accepted the obvious. As Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Georgia, Baruch Halpern, wrote a couple of years later, the Tel Dan inscription unmistakably indicates the existence of a dynasty in the 9th century BCE that traced its origin to David. After many years of searching by biblical archaeologists, finally, David had been found. Now, as you can imagine, this is the stuff Christian apologists' dreams are made of. In an age where archaeological proof of the biblical narratives is cited by many Christians as one of the foundations for their belief, tangible evidence for the existence of one of the great heroes of the Bible is a big deal. It's worth stating at this point that apologists do tend to run way too far with discoveries like the Tel Dan Stele. As Halpern pointed out, mention of the House of David actually isn't evidence for anything other than a dynasty in the 9th century BCE that traces origin to David. The stele isn't evidence that David penned psalms, or mourned Absalom, or killed Goliath. It isn't evidence of any of the events in the life of the biblical David, it's just evidence of a dynasty named after him. And it's worth keeping a cool head about that. Apologists shouldn't overplay their hand. If one day archaeologists working in Jerusalem find a huge skull with a hole in its forehead with "How's about that Goliath, you big hairy goon?" scratched on the side of it, then we can say that we have evidence of the stories of David. Until then, we don't have that. Funnily enough, it's to Professor Emeritus of Archaeology in the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Civilizations at Tel Aviv University, Israel Finkelstein, that we can turn to see a whole heap being made out of the inscription. Here's what he wrote with Neil Asher Silverman in their book, The Bible Unearthed. This is dramatic evidence of the fame of the Davidic dynasty less than 100 years after the reign of David's son Solomon. The fact that Judah, or perhaps its capital Jerusalem, is referred to with only a mention of its ruling house is clear evidence that the reputation of David was not a literary invention of a much later period. The house of David was known throughout the region. This clearly validates the biblical description of a figure named David becoming the founder of the dynasty of Judahite kings in Jerusalem. Now, when Finkelstein writes "not a literary invention," he's responding directly to the minimalist argument that the Bible's historical books were written far too late to contain any historically reliable information, like the Persian or even the Hellenistic era, and that their contents are literary fictions, as we heard before. In fact, in The Quest for the Historical Israel, Finkelstein went further, saying that the mention of the House of David in the Tel Dan inscription from the 9th century BCE leaves no doubt that David and Solomon were historical figures, and there is good reason to accept that many of the David stories in the books of Samuel, mainly the heroic tales and the description of his life as a bandit on the fringe of the Judean highlands, contain genuine, early historical memories. There's some pretty strong statements. Unsurprisingly, the discovery of the inscription and mention of the House of David was seen as serious egg on the minimalists' faces. After all, as we saw a few minutes ago, it was only 1 year earlier that Philip Davies claimed that David was a fiction and a literary creation. As Halpern predicted, publication of the Tel Dan inscription will likely not lay the issue to rest. He wasn't wrong. Only a few months later, the first journal article casting doubt on the stele's authenticity was published. Frederick Cryer of the University of Copenhagen published an article entitled "On the Recently Discovered House of David Inscription" in the Scandinavian Journal of the Old Testament. Here's what he had to say. Unhappily, there are grounds for skepticism in connection with the present find. The first of these is, as mentioned before, that there are reasons for uncertainty as far as the find context of the fragment is concerned. ... A fourth feature to be considered is topicality. In ancient historical research, as in the craft of the cloak and dagger spy, it is axiomatic that if one finds information just at the moment one needs it, it is very likely to be false. For the record, I doubt that the inscription is a forgery, but the matter will definitely bear further looking into. He gave a few reasons the inscription could be fake and then said, it's probably not. A couple of years later he was back at it. Without putting too fine a point on it, the archaeological context of the find is uncertain. But backpedaled again in the same article. I took what should, properly considered, be the first step in dealing with any new epigraphic find of uncertain provenance, which is to say that I examined the question of the authenticity of the inscription and arrived at a positive, if hesitant, evaluation. These nonsense claims of forgery petered out, with minimalist Niels Peter Lemke, Professor of Old Testament Studies at the University of Copenhagen, admitting that the arguments in favour of seeing the Tel Dan fragments as fake need to be much more forceful, certainly stronger than I have been able to show in this survey, if they are to prove beyond doubt that the inscription is the work of a forger. The consensus is that the inscription is authentic. Today it's only on the extreme fringes that you'll find anyone who thinks it's a forgery. As Professor of Ancient History and Archaeology at the George Washington University, Eric Klein writes, no serious scholar doubted the authenticity of the fragments. So what did the minimalists try next? Backflips. Instead of accepting the plainly obvious meaning of the inscription, the minimalists wrote up a number of other ways to read House of David. Here's what they came up with. Frederick Cryer wrote that maybe Beth David was the name used by the inscription's author for a geographical unit which may have been equivalent to all or some part of the region we regard as Judah. That's plain speculation. There's no evidence for the idea that people from the time of the inscription referred to the land of Judah as Beth David. He's pulled that straight out of the air. Lemke and Thompson suggested that it may be a place somewhere in the vicinity of ancient Dan. Again, speculation. There's nowhere in the area of Dan that's called Beth David. In the same article, they suggested that we would argue that it could also refer to the name of a holy place at Dan. More speculation. What other bright ideas did they have? Moving on from place names, the next suggestion was that, in the Bible, David can mean beloved or uncle. The house of uncle? Yeah, apparently a god called Uncle. This option was addressed by Professor of Egyptology at the University of Liverpool, Kenneth Kitchen, who wrote, and what of this mysterious deity, Dod, trundled out again by some commentators on the Tel Dan stele? Surely the time has now come to celebrate Dod's funeral permanently. There is not one scintilla of respectable, explicit evidence for his, her, its existence anywhere in the biblical and ancient Near Eastern world. No ancient king ever calls himself beloved of Dod, no temple of Dod has ever been found, and clearly identified as such by first-hand inscriptions. We have no hymns to Dod, no offering lists for Dod, no published rituals in any ancient language for Dod, no statues of Dod, no altars, vessels, nor any other ritual piece or votive object dedicated to Dod as a clear deity. Why? Because he, she, it never existed in antiquity, but is a modern invention by ingenious scholars from the last century. Dod is a dud deity, as dead as the dodo. House of Uncle is just jibber jabber. What next? Probably my favourite. Davies wrote, one place in the Bible it means kettle. So a number of ways of understanding David present themselves, most of them more plausible than translating David. House of Kettle, more plausible than the obvious House of David. Davies wasn't alone. Cryer wrote that there was an option that has not as yet, to my knowledge, received attention, is House of the Cauldrons. I mean, what? This stuff is just nonsense. And the thing is, they admit as much. In 2003, Lemke wrote, if a person is set on understanding this term as a reference to the House of David, extremely strong arguments are needed if a change of opinion is going to be brought about. And it is true to say that as yet, we have not found such strong arguments. The arguments we possess may be good enough to convince a person who would like to be convinced, but hardly anybody else. As he says, their arguments aren't strong, and the only people who accept them are those who would like to be convinced of them. So how did more mainstream scholars react to this? Well, it was quite funny for those looking on. Halpern wrote, "The recent discovery is causing extraordinary contortions among scholars who have maintained that the Bible's history of the early Israelite monarchy is simply fiction." Professor of Near Eastern Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of Arizona, William Dever, described the minimalist interpretations in similar ways, saying that several of the other revisionists have turned amusing intellectual somersaults to avoid the obvious meaning of the Dan inscription. Now that's all pretty funny, but there were a few low blows. One example, Professor Emeritus of Ancient Near Eastern Cultures and Semitic Linguistics at Tel Aviv University, Anson Rainey, wrote an article with the subheading, "Davies is an amateur who can safely be ignored," saying that Davies' objections are those of an amateur standing on the sidelines of epigraphic scholarship. That's pretty brutal. Another example was with Halpern, again, this time being so amazed at the nonsense that the minimalists suggested that he could only conclude that they were driven by non-academic motives. One may question the motives of the hysteria. They differ in different scholars. In one, the motivation may be a hatred of the Catholic Church, in another of Christianity, in another of the Jews, in another of all religion, in another of authority. I mean, it's fair enough. If they knew their arguments weren't strong and would only be believed by people who would want to believe them, that's hardly what scholarship is meant to be about, right? Still, it was all pretty brutal. So after all was said and done, Dever summarized the situation well. Regarding the authenticity of the inscription, we now have published opinions by most of the world's leading epigraphers, none of whom is a biblicist in Thompson's sense. The inscription means exactly what it says. The House of David. So for the rest of this video, we're going to stick with the consensus of the relevant scholars and carry on, accepting that the stele is legit, because it is, and that it really does mention the House of David, because it does. What really drove the last nails into the coffin of "it's a forgery" or "it says House of Kettle" was the discovery of 2 more pieces of the stele, 11 months after the first piece was found. The area just north of where the first piece of the stele was found was a whole load of debris. As it was being excavated, they found what eventually turned out to be a high place. 2 meters south of it, lying in the debris around 80 centimeters above the current ground level, the second piece of the stele was found by area supervisor Malka Herchkowitz. They called this new piece B1. Then, in the same excavation season, Guy Lacook, who'd found the first piece of the stele, was excavating the pavement behind the high place. As she stuck a measuring rod into the base of the wall, she spotted a third piece of the stele, which they called B2. And to this day, that's as much of the stele as has been found. So how did these 3 pieces relate? Well, Beran and Naver found that B1 and B2, even though they were found 8 meters apart, fitted together perfectly. And in a fascinating paper by Professor of Biblical Studies and Northwest Semitic Languages at the University of California, William Schneiderwind, says that B1 and B2 make an obvious join, calling it fragment B, like pretty much everyone else. Schneiderwind also says that the join between fragment A and B is less certain, but that this join forms a readable text with relatively minor difficulties. He goes on to explain that the join between fragment A and B that Beran and Naver suggested is supported by the way the text lines up, matching the sort of phraseology found in inscriptions of this sort of genre. André Lemaire, a French epigrapher, director of studies at the École Pratique des Hautes Études, also wrote, saying, "I've checked myself in the Hebrew Union College Museum the placement of fragments A and B, and I agree with the presentation of the Editio Princeps, which seemed to me the most probable, even if not practically certain." So, apart from a couple of scholars who say that either fragment A and B should be arranged vertically rather than side to side, or that they just aren't related at all, suggested no surprise by our minimalist friend Cryer, who naturally says that it's a foregone conclusion that Dan A has nothing to do with Dan B. Pretty much everyone goes with the arrangement suggested by Beran and Naver in the article they published fragment B in. So we'll continue following the consensus. Before we get to what the text says, we need to know when the inscription was written. As we've seen, the inscription was found in pieces scattered across a relatively wide area. Obviously, that's not how it originally stood. It would have been standing somewhere prominent so that people could read it, or if they were illiterate, at least be impressed by it, before it got smashed up. And that's how it was found, smashed to pieces. Not only was the inscription smashed, the pieces were found inside walls. They'd been used as filler to build those walls. Based on that, it's fair to say that the inscription must be older than the walls the pieces were found in. If the pieces are in a wall, they must have existed before the wall was built. You can't make a wall out of pieces that don't exist. Then, since the wall was found smashed, the wall must have been built before it was smashed. Again, simple logic. Also, about the wall, it can't be any older than the floor it was built on. The floor has to exist in order to build a wall on it. Also, the wall can't be any newer than the date it was destroyed. It has to exist before it can be destroyed. All pretty logical, I think. Based on that pretty simple set of rules, we can say that since the wall fragment A was found in was destroyed in the 730s BCE by Tiglath-Pileser III, and since the wall sits on a pavement that had lying on it pottery from the very late 9th century, the inscription can't be any newer than the late 9th century. William Dever, Israel Finkelstein, Kenneth Kitchen and William Schneiderwind all agree. The stele must have been written somewhere in the late 9th century, sometime in the 840s BCE. So what does the inscription say? Beran and Naver published a complete reconstruction of the text in the article they wrote on fragments B1 and B2. Here it is. It's written in a dialect of Old Aramaic, and even without the House of David bit, it's a massively significant find for those who study the way Aramaic developed over time and in different areas. There is a whole ton of fascinating stuff in the inscription, but what we're going to concentrate on in this video are lines 7, 8 and 9. Because though finding House of David was cool, it's what the rest of the sentence it was found in says that should make Christians sit up and pay attention. So those lines, 7 through 9, though they're fragmentary, can be reliably reconstructed. And what we'll see when we read the scholarship on it is that those lines contain mention of the names Ahaziah and Joram. Let's take a look at how the relevant scholars came up with that. Lines 7 and 8 say, "Somebody Ram, son of somebody, king of Israel." The king of Israel bit is very clear, but which king is it talking about? The only king, either of Israel or of Judah, whose name ends with Resh and Mem, is Jehoram. Jehoram, aka Joram's place in the biblical chronology, fits the dating of the stele. Moving on, lines 8 and 9, "I killed somebody Yahu, son of king of the house of David." The king reconstruction isn't certain. It's only the third of the 3 letters that make up Melech that have been preserved, and not all scholars accept the reconstruction, though most seem to. Yahu is the ending of a Hebrew theophoric name. It's a royal name, it's followed by the house of David, so the king of reconstruction doesn't really matter either way. So which royal in the 9th century had a name ending in Yahu? There's only one real candidate, Ahaziah. The name Ahaziah was borne by both a king of Israel and a king of Judah, but only one can be taken into consideration, the son of Jehoram and grandson of Jehoshaphat. The reading of Joram and Ahaziah, though fragmentary, is solid enough that Professor of Northwest Semitic Languages and Literatures at George Washington University, Christopher Ralston, writes of the inscription, "Some details nevertheless are preserved, namely, Hazael states that he killed King Jehoram, son of Ahab, the king of Israel, and that he killed King Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, king of the house of David, i.e. Judah." Those who remember their Sunday school lessons will remember that these two characters appear in 2 Kings 8, verse 28. Ahaziah went with Joram, son of Ahab, to wage war against King Hazael of Aram at Ramoth Gilead. Based on this, and a couple of other clues in the rest of the inscription, scholars have concluded that the author of the stele was Hazael. As Beran and Naver wrote, the text clearly indicates that the author of the stele was Hazael himself, although his name does not appear in the fragments found to date. Hazael is well known in historical records. For example, there's an inscription on a basalt statue written by Shalmaneser III. He clearly didn't think much of Hazael. "Hazael, son of nobody, seized the throne, called up a numerous army, and rose against me." It's the consensus position that Hazael, this son of nobody, was the Tel Dan stele's author. So that's all cool. We've got a house of David, Ahaziah, and Joram in an inscription written by Hazael. That's pretty awesome. But this is where we need to go beyond apologetics. In the next video, we'll get into much more murky waters when we attempt to line up the inscription with the biblical data. We'll find that we're not in apologetics anymore, Toto.